So how does it interrelate with other problems that we all suffer from time to time, such as anxiety, stress, and things like mental exhaustion?
Well, they're very closely related, so you very rarely get a depression without having other things like high anxiety at the same time. Depression is often characterized by dwelling on the past a lot, but you hardly ever get that without people also worrying about the future and being anxious about the future. Psychiatrists and psychologists usually put anxiety and depression in separate camps, but the new genetic evidence is suggesting they're much more dimensional, they're much more mixed, and also the treatments that work for depression tend to work for anxiety as well. So there's quite a lot of evidence that actually to make a too big a separation between anxiety, stress, depression, exhaustion isn't quite what is going on in the world.
Things like anger, irritability, road rage, typical explosions that we all see every day. Are they related to depression at all?
They can be. I mean, they're more likely to be related to stress because you often get, in high chronic stress, you get people showing a lot of anger, but also, and it depends on the age group. So, for example, in adolescent depression, there can be quite a lot of anger and irritability and hostility, which is how often within that age group a lot of sadness is expressed. It was previously thought that depression was a bit of a late life problem, late 50s, early 60s. And indeed, the evidence that people born in the first part of the 20th century seem to verify that.
Is the same true for kind of anxiety and stress and irritability? And
we weren't clear about that until about year 2000, where somebody published a big paper in one of the big journals in America. They'd traced the anxiety level of children and young people over the 30 years from the early 1950s all the way through to the mid-1980s. And they found exactly the same thing, that it looked as if the anxiety pattern in children and young people had become, that in a sense the whole bell-shaped curve had shifted towards greater anxiety by about one standard deviation, which means that whole swathes of children and young people who hadn't been anxious in the 1950s, as it were, if they were born in the 1980s, then they were likely to show anxiety, which had been virtually clinical levels 30 or 40 years ago.
What we regard as normal levels of anxiety and stress would have been regarded as a clinical level anxiety and stress 50 years ago. Is that true? Did I misunderstand that? Because that's quite an astonishing figure.
That's true in anxiety.
Yeah.
And now that we know the same is true of depression, that is that 50 years ago people would live out most of their life without getting these crushing depressions. But now that 35, 36% get depressed before the age of 18, then there's a whole life ahead of them, which is the biggest challenge, a whole life ahead of them, where they might actually get another depression. Because one of the things we now know is if you've been depressed once, you tend to get depressed again, at least in half the cases. And once you've been depressed twice, then the chances go up even further.
So does this suggest that depression is really a problem of how we deal with the world, the way we think, rather than a chemical imbalance in the way our brains are actually working?
Well, one of the inferences we can make from these big changes being so rapid and recent is that it can't be genetic changes. It can't be driven by our basic biological makeup. So there must be something else happening. And it must be environmental changes that have driven that. I mean, clearly, it could be that people are just recognizing depression that was always there, but now they're recognizing it more. But the fact that both clinical studies and epidemiological studies show up the same thing argues that it's not just that people are recognizing it better, because you control for the sort of questions you can ask and check that the questions asked are the same over those decades.
If you had to choose fundamental driving forces behind depression, what would they be?
Well, at the individual level, they're the way we think about life. So where we feel we are, as it were, in relation to other people, in relation to our own standards and the standards that other people set for us. So one of the ways in which society is changing is the way in which it expects us to do things, the targets it sets for us and so on. And when society sets us targets and says, meet those or else, then the best you can hope for from your work is relief when you've met your targets. On the other hand, if you've been depressed once, you do have a slightly increased threshold, and it rather depends why you got depressed. If you got depressed because of a big life event, for example, bereavement, unemployment, separation, the sort of reasons that would make any of us low, then so long as you don't have a repeat of those sort of events, then you don't not necessarily going to get depressed again. But the problem is that if you get depressed, the threshold for you getting depressed again is slightly altered. And if then you get depressed for a second time, what we know is the triggers of a third depression are less. So for example, you might need bereavement or unemployment the first time you get depressed. The second time it might be something slightly less of a stressor, but then the third, fourth time, then you may not need a stressor at all. By the time actually you've had 3, 4, 5 depression, it may be that you just wake up one morning feeling a bit low, and by the end of the day you're feeling very depressed. And in our studies we find, for example, that if we follow people up for about 12 months without offering any treatment to them, then if they've had 3 depressions in the past before they've come to see us, then between 60 and 80% of them will get depressed again in those next 12 months.
So people who become repeatedly depressed year after year, what proportion of their lives do they actually spend in that depressed state?
What they found was, and it's just been published in the last couple of years, is that people on average spend 32% of their time in episode over the 20-year period. So on average 4 months a year are spent in episodes of depression, which, I mean, considering the burden that we talked about earlier, it's an incredible statistic.
That's a really disturbing statistic.
It's a combination of experiences, of distortions, you might say, in the way you think, the way you feel, the body and your impulses. So if you take each in turn, your thoughts are dominated by ideas of helplessness, rejection, being a failure, not being good enough, not being worth your space in the world. You feel like the lowest of the low. Your feelings get bombarded. There's feelings of sadness, of hopelessness, of worthlessness, and they're very closely tied in with your thoughts. If you can imagine somebody standing behind you all day saying how useless you were, then sooner or later you'd feel sad, irritable, run down, exhausted, and a miserable failure. And that's the way in which the feelings reflect those thoughts. It was down to long-term beliefs, often picked up in childhood and adolescence, beliefs like, I should be happy all the time, or beliefs like, to admit any weakness is a shameful thing to do. But when you get certain circumstances, so for example, if you think that one failure means your failure as a person, then you're perfectly okay until you start failing. But then you conclude, I'm a failure as a person. And in addition to having to do with your recent failure, which is bad enough, you now have to deal with something else, which is feeling a failure as a person. Or for example, you may think, I should be happy all the time. Now that's not by itself a depressing thing to think, but what happens if you feel sad? Now, not only do you have to deal with your sadness in as skillful a way as possible, but you now have to deal with something else, which is you should be happy. You now feel guilty as well as sad because you've just violated one of your sort of fundamental attitudes and beliefs in the way you work in the world. They call them dysfunctional attitudes, these long-term core beliefs. What was the underlying psychological factors that kept you at risk?
And what were they? Was this the famous diving experiments?
It all comes back to what's called context effects in learning and memory. That's where the diving comes in. So we've known for a long while that if you learn something in one set of conditions, even if you forget them when you're outside those conditions, you tend to remember them better when you come back. So for example, people might find that if they've learned maths in the maths room at school, then if they do a maths test in the French room, where they learn French, then they don't do so well put them back in the maths room, and all the cues that were around when you learnt maths, even if you've taken the symbols and formulae off the walls, people do better. Or you might know if you think of something you need upstairs to another room in the house, you go upstairs, when you get there you can't think what you've come for. You go back to the place where you first thought of it, and suddenly it comes back to your mind. So changing context can be quite a powerful effect on memory. And that's where the diving experiments come in. Deep sea divers, when the North Sea was being opened up for oil exploration, they found they were forgetting stuff when they went down under the water. They brought in some psychologists to advise them on what they could do. And the psychologists realized, as my colleagues Alan Badley and Duncan Godden, doing this work in the 1970s and 80s, they realized that this wasn't just that when you were underwater it was very dark and murky and you tended to forget anything. It's what you'd learnt on the beach you forget when you're underwater. But if you learn stuff underwater, you forget it when you come on the beach. It was another example, once again, of context-dependent learning. So what you learn in one context, you may forget, but when you go back into the context, it comes back.
So is this because the brain is somehow learning to use the environment as a store of information?
Precisely. That actually the brain has an amazing way of meshing with your environment, that you don't need to store everything in the brain. The world is a better store of information and knowledge than your brain is. And therefore, when you go into certain contexts, if if you go back to a childhood place where you grew up, you might not remember much about it, but when you're walking down the street in that childhood place, all sorts of memories come flooding back. In one sense, they are, in a rudimentary form, encoded in the brain, but they need that extra activation of the outside context. And the interesting thing about that is this, that about 20, 30 years ago, psychologists discovered that your mood could act just like a context. In other words, when you get depressed, anything that you think, feel, remember when you're in that state, when you're out of depression, it may not bother you at all, but just another episode of sad mood can bring with it all those memories, thoughts, interpretations you had when you were last depressed. And this was a big development when people started to say, well, let's invite people to come into the lab and to experience depression for 10 minutes in a fairly small way. And the way to do that is, there's a number of ways to do it, obviously thinking sad memories or reading sad things on a bit of paper, but you can actually do an experiment in which you do all of that, but you also play sad music. And we tend to use Prokofiev, Russia Under the Mongolian Yoke, played at half speed. And when you do that, what you find is very slow, it's very dirgy, together with sad memories and sad things written on paper. After 10 minutes, people feel quite low. Not devastatingly low, but quite low. And what you can do is you invite people into the lab, some of whom have never been depressed in the past, and some of whom have been depressed, but they're now completely recovered. So at the start of the experiment, you can't tell who's been depressed and who's not. And then you give them a scale to measure their level of dysfunctional attitudes. So things like, I should be happy all the time, it's shameful to display your weaknesses, I have to succeed at everything or I'm a complete failure. And at the start of the experiment, they don't score very high on that because they're feeling good. Now, you give them 10 minutes of Prokofiev, and afterwards the people who've never been depressed hardly change at all. But the people who've been depressed in the past, suddenly, all these patterns of thinking all turn up again. And what's most striking, we've done this work as well with people who've been not only depressed in the past, but suicidal in the past. That extends it even further, because what we discover then is not only do people become dysfunctional, as in normal experiments on depression, but they start to get a tunnel vision about ways of solving their problems, thus revealing suicide as the only option. It's the sort of sense in which other options disappear, and that happens very rapidly over just 8 or 10 minutes of this mood. And at the end of the experiment, you talk people through that, they recover, and actually at the end of these experiments, people are really interested. They've learned something important about themselves, which is that their mood creates, if it isn't bad enough, the mood can create more devastating consequences by pulling back, by dragging up all these old regrets, arguments, failures and disappointments from the past. And that if it's not enough to deal with your mood now, to deal with all these things from the past as well, and it always turns up as if it's relevant now. You don't think, I used to believe I was a failure. You actually believe now that you're a complete failure, and this just proves it. And that's what makes it have such a huge impact.